Jason Miller stood in the kitchen, helping set the dinner table, while soft music played quietly from an old speaker near the window. Outside, the Seattle evening sky had already turned gray with light rain tapping gently against the glass. The house smelled like pasta sauce, garlic bread, and fresh coffee. Familiar smells that always made the place feel warm even when everything else felt quiet. "Can you grab the drinks?" his father called from the stove. "Yeah," Jason replied distractedly. He opened the fridge, pulling out 3 bottles before placing them carefully on the table. His movements were calm, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Because Ethan was coming over. Just the thought of it made him more nervous than he wanted to admit. Jason had known Ethan Brooks for almost 3 years now. What started as a friendship through mutual friends had slowly become the closest connection Jason had with anyone. Ethan had this easy confidence about him that made people naturally feel comfortable around him. He laughed loudly, spoke honestly, and somehow always knew exactly how to lighten the mood in a room. Jason admired that about him, probably more than he should have. At first, he ignored the feelings completely. He convinced himself it was just admiration, just friendship. But over time, those feelings became harder to deny, especially during moments like this. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. His father glanced toward him. That's probably Ethan. Jason tried to act normal. "I got it." He walked quickly to the door, taking a small breath before opening it. Ethan stood there wearing a dark hoodie dampened slightly from the rain, his messy brown hair falling across his forehead. The second he saw Jason, a relaxed smile appeared on his face. "There he is," Ethan said casually. Jason smiled back automatically. "You're late." "Traffic," Ethan replied dramatically. "And honestly, your neighborhood is confusing. You've been here like 50 times. Still confusing." Jason laughed softly and stepped aside so Ethan could come in. The moment Ethan walked into the house, the atmosphere somehow felt lighter. "Hey, Robert." Ethan greeted warmly as he entered the kitchen. Jason's father smiled while stirring the sauce. "Good to see you again." "You too." Ethan had always gotten along well with Jason's father. That made things easier and harder at the same time. Easier because Ethan already felt like part of the house. Harder because Jason constantly worried his feelings might eventually become obvious. Dinner started normally enough. The 3 of them sat around the table talking casually about work, sports, movies, and random stories from the week. Ethan kept making sarcastic comments that made both Jason and his father laugh. At one point, Ethan nearly spilled his drink while telling a story about getting lost downtown earlier that week. "You're actually hopeless," Jason said, shaking his head. "I survived, didn't I?" "Barely." Robert laughed quietly from across the table. "I'm starting to think Jason's the responsible one between you two." "That's terrifying," Ethan replied immediately. The warmth around the dinner table felt natural, comfortable. Jason found himself watching Ethan more than he probably should. Small things most people wouldn't notice. The way he smiled while talking. The way he leaned back in his chair when he laughed. The calm confidence in his voice whenever he spoke. Every little thing made Jason's feelings harder to ignore. At one point during dinner, Ethan caught him staring briefly. Jason looked away almost instantly, pretending to focus on his food. Still, he noticed a faint smile Ethan tried to hide afterward. That tiny moment stayed in Jason's mind longer than it should have. After dinner, Robert stood up to collect some plates. "You two go relax. I'll clean up." "You sure?" Jason asked. Robert waved him off. "Go." Ethan stood immediately. "I'm not arguing with free relaxation." Jason rolled his eyes slightly, smiling despite himself. The 2 of them headed upstairs toward Jason's room, like they had done countless times before. But tonight felt different somehow. Maybe because Jason had spent the entire evening trying not to think about feelings he could no longer fully hide from himself. Inside the room, Ethan dropped comfortably onto the bed while Jason closed the door behind them. Jason's room was dimly lit with soft warm light from the desk lamp near the corner. Rain continued falling quietly outside the window, making the entire room feel calm and isolated from the rest of the world. Ethan leaned back against the pillows casually. "Your dad still makes better pasta than any restaurant." That's because he cooks like he's feeding an army every night. I'm not complaining. Jason laughed softly before sitting down beside him, leaving enough space between them to keep things feeling normal. At least he tried to. For a while, they talked the same way they always did. Easy conversations, random jokes, discussions about movies and future plans. Ethan told stories about work, while Jason listened quietly, occasionally teasing him whenever he exaggerated details too much. But slowly, the atmosphere began changing. Not dramatically, just subtly. The conversations became quieter. Longer pauses started appearing between sentences. At some point, Ethan stretched out more comfortably on the bed, his shoulder brushing lightly against Jason's arm. Neither of them moved away. Jason's heart immediately became more aware of every small thing. The warmth beside him, the closeness, the way Ethan's voice sounded softer now in the quiet room. Jason hated how nervous he suddenly felt, because deep down, part of him knew this wasn't just friendship anymore. And maybe Ethan was starting to feel it too. The thought both excited and terrified him. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, while downstairs the house slowly grew quieter. The distance between Jason and Ethan no longer felt accidental now. It felt noticeable, important somehow. At one point, Ethan turned slightly toward him. "You okay?" Jason blinked. "Yeah. Why?" "You've been quiet." Jason forced a small smile. "Just tired." Ethan studied him carefully for a second, like he didn't fully believe the answer. But he didn't push further. Instead, he leaned back again, their shoulders still touching lightly. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt heavy with things neither of them knew how to say yet. And sitting there beside Ethan in the soft glow of his bedroom lamp, Jason slowly realized that hiding his feelings. The rain outside grew heavier as the night went on, tapping steadily against the bedroom windows while the rest of the house slowly became quiet. Jason sat beside Ethan on the bed, trying to focus on the conversation, but his thoughts kept drifting. Every small movement between them suddenly felt noticeable now. The occasional brush of shoulders, the warmth coming from Ethan sitting so close, the calm sound of his voice filling the room. It felt different tonight. Not uncomfortable, just impossible to ignore. Ethan leaned back against the wall behind the bed, stretching his arms slightly. "Your room's way too comfortable," he said casually. "I'm probably going to fall asleep here." Jason smirked faintly. "You say that every time." "Because it's true every time." Jason laughed softly, but the nervousness inside him never fully disappeared. The conversations between them became slower after that. Not awkward exactly, more thoughtful, like both of them were becoming careful about the things they said. At one point, Ethan glanced toward the rain-covered window. "You ever think life feels weirdly lonely sometimes?" Jason looked at him, slightly surprised by the sudden seriousness in his voice. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "More often than I probably should." Ethan nodded slowly, staring down at his hands now. "Same." The honesty in that moment changed something between them. Jason had always known Ethan as confident and relaxed, someone who seemed comfortable in every situation. Hearing vulnerability in his voice felt strangely intimate. "I guess people just get good at pretending they're okay," Jason said softly. Ethan looked back at him. "You do that a lot." Jason smiled weakly. "Maybe." Silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt casual. It felt emotional. Ethan studied him quietly for a few seconds before speaking again. "You know, you're probably the only person I actually feel calm around." Jason's chest tightened slightly hearing that. He tried hiding how much the words affected him, but Ethan noticed anyway. "You okay?" Ethan asked gently. Jason let out a quiet, nervous laugh. "Honestly, not really." Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" Jason hesitated. Every instinct told him to avoid the truth, to laugh it off and change the subject before things became too real. But he was tired of pretending, especially around Ethan. "I think," Jason started quietly before stopping himself. Ethan waited patiently. "What?" Jason looked down briefly, then forced himself to continue. "I think being around you makes things complicated for me." The room became completely silent. Ethan didn't move. Neither did Jason. For a second, Jason immediately regretted saying anything at all. But then Ethan spoke softly. Complicated how? Jason swallowed nervously. You probably already know. Ethan stared at him carefully, his expression unreadable now. And somehow, that silence told Jason everything. Because Ethan didn't look confused. He looked nervous, too. A slow breath escaped Ethan before he leaned his head back slightly against the wall. I was wondering if I was imagining it. Jason looked up at him immediately. What? This, Ethan admitted quietly. Whatever's been happening between us lately. Jason's heartbeat suddenly felt impossible to ignore. You noticed it too? Ethan gave a small laugh under his breath. Jason, I noticed it a long time ago. That answer hit harder than Jason expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. The tension between them felt obvious now. Years of friendship mixed with feelings neither of them had known how to face until tonight. Jason stared at Ethan carefully, searching his expression for uncertainty. Instead, he found honesty, and maybe relief. Ethan shifted slightly closer on the bed, slowly enough that Jason had time to move away if he wanted to. He didn't. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to ruin what we already had, Ethan admitted softly. Jason smiled sadly. Yeah, same. Their shoulders touched again, but now it felt intentional, important. Outside, thunder rumbled quietly in the distance, while warm light from a bedside lamp softened the entire room around them. Ethan looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. You know what's funny? Jason shook his head slightly. I came over tonight planning to act completely normal. Jason laughed quietly. And how's that working out for you? Terribly. That made both of them smile. The nervousness between them softened slightly after that, not disappearing completely, but becoming easier somehow. Jason looked down briefly at his hands before speaking quietly. I don't really know what happens now. Ethan's voice became softer too. Maybe we stop pretending. The words settled deeply between them. Jason looked up slowly. Ethan was closer now than he realized. Close enough that Jason could feel the warmth of his breath in the quiet room. For a second, time almost seemed to pause. Neither of them rushed the moment. Neither of them wanted to break it. Then Ethan moved carefully, giving Jason every chance to stop him if he wanted to. But Jason stayed exactly where he was. Their first kiss was soft, slow, more emotional than either of them expected. It wasn't rushed or impulsive. It felt like something that had been building quietly between them for a very long time. Jason felt warmth spread through his chest almost instantly, mixed with nervousness, relief, and disbelief all at once. When they finally pulled apart slightly, neither of them spoke immediately. Ethan looked almost surprised himself. Jason laughed nervously under his breath. Wow. Ethan smiled softly. Yeah. The tension in the room shifted after that, not disappearing, changing, becoming warmer, closer. Jason leaned back slightly against the pillows while Ethan stayed beside him, both of them still trying to process what had just happened. I can't believe we actually did that, Jason admitted quietly. Ethan smirked faintly. Honestly, I wanted it for a while. Jason turned toward him immediately. Seriously? Ethan looked slightly embarrassed for the first time all night. Don't make me regret being honest. Jason laughed softly, shaking his head. For the first time that evening, the nervousness between them became mixed with something lighter. Comfort. Real comfort. They stayed talking for hours after that. About feelings they'd ignored. About moments that suddenly made sense now. About fear, friendship, and how neither of them had expected things to change this way. Downstairs, the house remained quiet, while upstairs, inside the warm glow of Jason's bedroom. For the next few days, everything between Jason and Ethan felt different. Better, but also fragile. The comfort between them had deepened after that night in Jason's room. Their conversations became softer, more personal, filled with quiet smiles and lingering eye contact that neither of them tried hiding anymore. Still, neither of them fully knew what to call what was happening between them. They just knew it mattered. One evening, Ethan came over again for dinner like he usually did. On the surface, everything looked normal. Robert talked casually about work, while Ethan joked about nearly getting fired for arriving late again. Jason laughed more than usual, though part of him stayed nervous the entire time. Because now every interaction felt dangerous somehow. Every accidental glance, every smile, every moment that lasted a second too long. Jason constantly worried his father would notice something had changed between them. And deep down, he already had. Robert wasn't blind. Over the past week, he'd quietly noticed the way Jason looked at Ethan sometimes. The sudden nervousness whenever their shoulders brushed near the kitchen counter. The way Ethan's attention always drifted back toward Jason without realizing it. At first, Robert ignored it. Or maybe he hoped he was imagining it. But the feeling stayed. After dinner that night, the three of them cleaned the kitchen together before Robert eventually headed downstairs to finish some paperwork. "You two try not to destroy the house," he joked casually before leaving. "No promises," Ethan replied. Jason laughed softly, though his stomach tightened slightly. A few minutes later, Jason and Ethan went upstairs to his room again. The second the bedroom door closed behind them, the atmosphere immediately changed. Not because anything dramatic happened, because now they no longer needed to pretend when they were alone. Jason sat beside Ethan on the bed, while rain tapped lightly against the windows again. Almost mirroring the night everything first changed between them. Ethan leaned back comfortably against the wall. "Your dad definitely suspects something." Jason sighed immediately. "I know. You think he's upset?" "I honestly can't tell." The uncertainty in Jason's voice made Ethan quieter. Neither of them wanted conflict, especially not inside the house Jason had spent his entire life in. Ethan reached over gently, brushing his fingers against Jason's hand. "Hey!" Jason looked at him. "We'll figure it out." Jason smiled faintly, though nervousness still lingered behind his eyes. For a while, they tried ignoring the tension by talking about random things again. Movies, work, old memories from when they first became friends. But eventually the conversation faded, and silence took over instead. A comfortable silence. Jason looked over at Ethan quietly. "You know what scares me most?" he asked softly. Ethan turned toward him slightly. "What?" "That things are finally good, and I keep waiting for something to ruin it." Ethan's expression softened immediately. Without thinking much about it, he moved closer and wrapped an arm gently around Jason's shoulders. Jason relaxed against him almost instantly. The closeness felt natural now. Safe. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They simply stayed there together, while soft rain and distant thunder filled the silence around them. Then Ethan tilted his head slightly toward Jason. Their kiss this time felt less nervous than the first one. Still soft, still emotional, but more certain now. Jason closed his eyes briefly, letting himself forget everything else for just a second. The fear, the stress, the uncertainty waiting outside the room. But downstairs, Robert had started noticing how long the house had gone quiet. At first, he ignored it while organizing papers in the living room. Then concern slowly replaced distraction. Finally, after several minutes passed, he headed upstairs intending only to check if they wanted coffee before the rain got worse outside. The hallway was dark except for the faint light coming from under Jason's bedroom door. Robert reached the door and knocked lightly once. No answer. He frowned slightly before pushing the door open halfway, and froze. Inside the room, Jason and Ethan pulled apart instantly in shock. The silence that followed felt crushing. Robert stared at them both, disbelief written across his face. Jason's heart dropped immediately. "Dad, what is this?" Robert interrupted sharply. The tone in his voice made Jason stand up immediately from the bed. "It's not." But even Jason knew there was no believable explanation anymore. Ethan stepped back awkwardly, guilt and panic immediately appearing across his face. Robert looked between them both again, his expression growing harder with confusion and frustration. "You too!" He stopped himself, struggling to even finish the sentence. Jason felt heat rush into his face. "Dad, please just..." "How long has this been happening?" The question hit the room heavily. Neither of them answered immediately. That silence told Robert enough. His disappointment became painfully visible. Not hatred, not disgust. Something more emotional than that. Shock, confusion, fear. Jason had never seen his father look at him like that before. Ethan finally spoke carefully. "Mr. Miller, I'm sorry. Robert immediately cut him off. "I need a minute." The quiet anger in his voice felt worse than shouting. He turned and walked out of the room before either of them could stop him. The second he disappeared down the hallway, silence crashed heavily over the room again. Jason stood frozen beside the bed, breathing unevenly. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face anxiously. Jason looked away immediately, panic rising in his chest now. Everything felt ruined. The safe comfort they built together over the past week suddenly felt fragile enough to collapse completely. Downstairs, they could hear cabinets opening and closing harder than usual. Neither of them moved. Neither of them knew what to say anymore. Finally, Jason sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring down at the floor. "He's never looked at me like that before," he said quietly. Ethan stayed standing nearby, guilt written all over his face. "This is my fault." Jason looked up immediately. "No, it's not. If I hadn't..." "Stop." Jason stood again, frustrated now. "Don't act like this happened because of only you." Ethan stayed silent, because part of him truly believed Jason's life would be easier without him complicating things. That thought hurt more than he expected. The rest of the night passed painfully. The days after Robert discovered the truth felt painfully quiet inside the house. Not angry, not explosive, just heavy. Jason noticed the difference immediately. Conversations became shorter. Meals were quieter. Even the atmosphere inside the home felt unfamiliar now, like everyone was carefully avoiding stepping into the emotional tension hanging between them. Robert spent more time alone downstairs after work, often sitting silently in the living room with the television on, without really watching it. Jason hated it, more than the arguments, more than the shock. The distance hurt most. Meanwhile, Ethan stopped visiting entirely. At first, Jason understood why. The situation had become uncomfortable for everyone, and Ethan didn't want to make things harder. Still, every day without him felt emptier than Jason expected. Their texts became less frequent too, not because the feelings between them disappeared, because both of them were afraid. Jason worried Ethan might decide walking away would be easier. Ethan worried he had damaged the relationship between Jason and his father beyond repair. One evening, after nearly a week of silence inside the house, Jason finally found his father sitting alone in the kitchen drinking coffee. The rain outside had returned again, soft and steady against the windows. Robert looked tired, older somehow. Jason hesitated near the doorway before quietly speaking. "Can we talk?" Robert stayed silent for a second before nodding toward the chair across from him. Jason sat down slowly. For a moment, neither of them knew where to begin. Finally, Robert sighed softly and rubbed a hand over his face. "I've been trying to understand everything." Jason looked down at the table. "I know." Another silence followed. Then Robert asked quietly, "How long have you felt this way?" Jason hesitated before answering honestly. "A while." Robert nodded slowly, staring into his coffee now. "And Ethan..." Jason couldn't stop the small smile that appeared despite everything. "He cares about me." The softness in Jason's voice didn't go unnoticed. Robert looked at him carefully for the first time in days, not with anger anymore, with emotion. "I think what shocked me most," Robert admitted quietly, "was realizing my son grew up without me noticing certain parts of him." Jason's chest tightened hearing that. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said softly. Robert let out a quiet breath. Maybe not intentionally. The honesty in that sentence hurt more than Jason expected. For years after Jason's mother passed away, Robert had focused so much on simply surviving, working, paying bills, trying to keep life stable, that emotional conversations slowly disappeared from their relationship. Neither of them had noticed the distance growing until now. "I was scared to tell you," Jason admitted finally. Robert looked up immediately. "Not because I thought you'd hate me," Jason continued quietly. "I just didn't want you to look at me differently." The pain in his voice settled heavily between them. Robert's expression softened completely for the first time since that night. "You're still my son," he said firmly. Jason looked down immediately, emotions tightening in his chest. For several seconds, neither of them spoke again. Then Robert asked carefully, "Does Ethan make you happy?" Jason answered without hesitation this time. Yeah. The certainty in his voice said everything. Robert leaned back slowly in his chair, processing the answer quietly. The tension inside the room didn't disappear instantly, but something important shifted. Understanding. Maybe not complete yet, but real. A few days later, Jason received a text from Ethan asking if they could meet. They met at a small coffee shop downtown on a gray afternoon. The second Ethan saw Jason walking toward him, relief immediately appeared across his face. "You okay?" Ethan asked softly once they sat down. Jason nodded slightly, trying to be. Ethan looked guilty again. "I didn't want to make things worse between you and your dad." "You didn't." Ethan looked unconvinced. Jason reached across the table gently, resting his hand over Ethan's for the first time in public. "It's complicated," Jason admitted quietly, "but we're talking now." Ethan relaxed slightly hearing that. For the next hour, they spoke honestly about everything they'd both been feeling. The fear, the guilt, the uncertainty about the future. But underneath all of it, one thing remained obvious. Neither of them wanted to lose the other. That realization mattered more than anything else. A week later, something unexpected happened. Robert invited Ethan over again. Jason nearly thought he heard wrong when his father casually mentioned it during dinner preparations. "Wait, seriously?" Robert sighed softly while chopping vegetables in the kitchen. "Jason, I'm still adjusting to everything. But avoiding him forever isn't helping anyone." Jason stared at him for a second before quietly smiling. That evening felt awkward at first. Of course it did. Ethan arrived looking more nervous than Jason had ever seen him before. Robert stayed quieter than usual during dinner, and for the first 20 minutes the conversation struggled to feel natural. But slowly, little pieces of normal life returned. Robert made a sarcastic comment about Ethan always being late. Ethan defended himself dramatically. Jason laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. And somehow, that small moment broke the tension enough for everyone to finally breathe again. Later that night, after dinner ended and the dishes were cleaned, Robert stopped Jason briefly in the hallway. "I'm still learning," he admitted quietly, "but I don't want fear or confusion ruining this family." Jason felt emotion tighten in his chest instantly. "Thank you," he said softly. Robert nodded once before returning downstairs. Jason stood there for a moment trying to process the relief washing through him. For the first time since everything happened, hope finally felt stronger than fear. Upstairs, Ethan waited quietly inside Jason's room. The second Jason walked in, Ethan immediately noticed the expression on his face. "That good, huh?" Ethan asked carefully. Jason smiled softly. "Yeah." Ethan stepped closer. "Your dad okay?" Jason nodded slowly. "I think he's trying." Ethan looked genuinely relieved hearing that. The silence between them felt warm now instead of uncertain. Jason moved closer until their hands naturally found each other again. "No more hiding?" Ethan asked quietly. Jason smiled faintly. "No more hiding."